Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. The civil rights movement championed by Martin Luther King Jr. spurred changes in the mid-'60s that built the foundation for equity in schools, the workplace, and in the voting booth. 60 years later, some Native civil rights advocates worry that foundation is crumbling. The Department of Justice has all but dismantled its own civil rights oversight, even as officials question the aggressive tactics by federal agents on the streets of Minneapolis. We'll assess how King's vision for civil rights holds up in 2026, right after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. Alaska is launching pilot programs in Anchorage and Juneau to offer addiction treatment in mobile care units. Emergency responders will give people medication to help them survive after an overdose. Indigenous Alaskans die of overdose at about 3 times the rate of white Alaskans. Alaska Public Media's health reporter Rachel Cassandra has more.
Dr. Jennifer Pierce shows off a new SUV.
It is not really marked
For the Anchorage Fire Department's pilot program.
We want people to see us as a beacon of help.
Pierce has a simple mission: to treat Anchorage residents who overdose and connect them with care afterwards. For the first time in a mobile unit in Alaska, responders can give patients the medication buprenorphine,
For when we respond on scenes, we can provide that very quickly.
which reduces withdrawals and can get patients on the road to recovery.
We don't want people to fall through the cracks.
Narcan, or naloxone, is used to reverse overdoses, but it puts people into withdrawal. And research shows that offering that second medication, buprenorphine, makes it more likely patients will enter long-term recovery. But Pierce says even if people don't continue treatment, the medication reduces the risk of a second overdose in the days immediately following, a dangerous window according to research. She hopes the program saves lives.
Even if it's just one life, right? We're saving lives out there and preventing individuals maybe from overdosing the next day or overdosing again later and dying.
Pierce visited successful programs in Texas and Washington for ideas and best practices to replicate in Alaska. Dr. Quigley Peterson says he's seen the healing benefits of buprenorphine. He's an emergency room physician heading Juneau's mobile pilot program. He says he's confident it will do well partly because he's seen how helpful the medication can be in the emergency room.
We have something that can help engage people that's super safe and it's cheap and that it works.
He says they'll collect data over the year to see what happens to patients after they're given buprenorphine for an overdose. His hope is that it reduces emergency room visits and calls for emergency medical care. In Anchorage, I'm Rachel Cassandra.
A Navajo man was facing the tribe's criminal justice system after allegedly driving drunk and killing a 3-year-old boy at a Christmas parade on the reservation. As KJZZ's Gabriel Pietrazio reports, U.S. authorities are now stepping in to prosecute him in federal court.
67-year-old Stanley Begay Jr. was charged with vehicular manslaughter and could have faced up to a year in prison and a $5,000 fine. Now a grand jury in Arizona is handing him 3 counts, including second-degree murder stemming from the death of 3-year-old Carson Apodaca. The agency's Phoenix field office is seeking photos and videos from that incident that can be used in the case against Begay, who has been assigned a Flagstaff attorney. He could face up to a life sentence. For National Native News, I'm Gabriel Pietrazio.
Following this year's State of the Tribes address in South Dakota, Governor Larry Roden met with more than 50 dignitaries from 8 of the state's 9 tribes. He says he left the private meeting feeling optimistic about the future of state-tribal relations.
There were things that we were palms up with them as far as some of the concerns, some of the areas that we disagreed on, and we agreed to disagree, and we had more conversation. As we walked out of the room, we had built a relationship, and I think we'll continue to build on that. It was a product of just open, honest conversation.
State-tribal relations effectively collapsed during the administration of former Governor Kristi Noem, who was at one point banned from every reservation in the state. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tribal Development Partners, helping tribes build toward their goals through 105L leasing and essential facility development, empowering sovereignty, strengthening community. More at tribaldevpartners.com, proud supporters of this show.
Support by the American Indian College Fund, providing millions of dollars of scholarships to Native students every year. Applications are accepted through May 31st at collegefund.org or by phone at 800-766-FUND.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the federal law that promised equal access to voting regardless of race or religion. The document was a milestone in the civil rights movement championed by Martin Luther King Jr. That milestone in American history also ushered in legislation to protect against discrimination in education, the workplace, housing, and all areas of American society. Today, many civil rights advocates say those protections that King and other civil rights leaders devoted their lives to are eroding. In this hour, we'll get perspectives on the status of civil rights for Native Americans. Where do you see progress to ensure civil rights for all citizens? Let us know. You can join us by calling 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now in Michigan is Winona Single. She is an associate professor of law and the director of the Indigenous Law and Policy Center at Michigan State University. She's an enrolled member of the Little Traverse Band of Odawa Indians. Winona, hello, and welcome to Native America Calling.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Joining us from Storrs, Connecticut is Dr. Sandy Grande. She is a professor of political science and Native American and Indigenous Studies at the University of Connecticut. She is Quechua. Sandy, hello, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Hi, Sean. It's always great to be on, and hello to Winona also. Looking forward to your comments.
And joining us from Marquette, Michigan is Caroline Laporte. She is a staff attorney with the Indian Law Resource Center and associate judge for the Little River Band of Odawa Indians, and she is an immediate descendant of the Little River Band of Odawa Indians. Caroline, you've been on the show before. Caroline, welcome back. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, and I also look forward to both Sandy and Winona's comments.
I do too. And I'm going to go ahead and begin with you, Caroline, because let's talk about what's happening in Minneapolis. There is so much video out there on social media, on TV, ICE agents at work. They're stopping people, removing them from cars and homes. We see political leaders, civil rights organizations, others saying these are civil rights violations. What are the challenges now toward investigating and prosecuting these allegations?
Well, I think one question, right, is that under Perderma, which is a new ruling that the Supreme Court issued, whether or not Justice Kavanaugh, in his majority opinion, has given permission for ICE agents in particular to stop individuals on a set of 4 factors, and the first of those factors being on the basis of their apparent race or ethnicity. I mean, that itself is a pretty clear violation of the equal protection of law. Even where those detentions, as he wrote or espoused in his opinion, are minimal in terms of time and in terms of inconvenience. Now, I think most people who get detained by law enforcement can tell you that those stops go one of 2 ways. And as we've seen with ICE agents, especially here in Minneapolis right now, those stops haven't been going really in the way of people feeling safe or with those detentions being minimal intrusions into people's lives.
Caroline, an ICE officer, of course, everybody has seen the video now, shot and killed a woman, and officials say she was trying to run him over. It's on video, of course. What people see in that video often depends on which side they are on right now in this current polarized country that we live in. And we see the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Office saying it will not open an investigation. Is this the end of it?
I want to say no. I'm curious what Winona and Sandy think too. I feel very disheartened. I think anytime that we have to rely right on the federal government to bring actions on behalf of citizens or even on behalf of tribal governments, you're at the whim really of a politicized space. And I think right now that space has become exponentially politicized. And I think that for people to have a mistrust, at the very least, is justified.
Winona, what are your thoughts? I'd like you to chime in here as well.
I completely agree. I think that what's happening in Minneapolis is extremely disturbing. It's called Operation Metro Surge, and it's basically the DHS has brought in 3,000 people who are members of ICE in this massive action, and we're seeing that there are just blatant, horrific violations of people's rights every day. And the violence is really concerning. And I think also an important development here is that just about 3 days ago, a federal judge in Minnesota just issued a preliminary injunction against basically affirming that ICE needs to comply with individuals' civil rights. But the facts of the individuals who make up the plaintiffs and their interactions with ICE were really chilling, just really disturbing, because you have folks who basically, for example, a woman who is standing 6 feet away from an ICE action at 6 a.m. with her hands down by her sides, who was basically taken down by ICE just for standing 6 feet away, and forcibly taken to the ground and arrested and detained, and had her wedding ring cut off her finger, had all of her clothes disposed of and never returned to her. And, there's just so many examples. And of course, of what we've also seen, of course, with Renee Good, but the separate facts surrounding the individuals that were plaintiffs in this case, where this preliminary injunction was issued, were just really, really disturbing. Instances, for example, where in one case, someone named Abdikadir Noor was basically trying to tell people to, move away, and trying to help the protesters from, having greater conflict. And and so ICE agents basically said, get him, even though he was actually trying to promote more peace. And he didn't, physically interfere with anybody, and yet he was also detained. And so, there's just many examples in this order that were really disturbing. And it's clear that ICE agents do not have proper training, are not using what are well recognized as safe practices to minimize the potential for unnecessary violence. And in fact, they're, of course, we see them escalating violence unnecessarily and creating a real tinderbox in Minneapolis. And it's just very concerning, because I see this as a place where it's going to continue to ramp up in Minneapolis, but also we're seeing it happen. It's going to be happening in other cities as well.
Okay. Thank you, Caroline. Sandy, I'd like you to weigh in as well. And what are your thoughts? I mean, do you get the feeling that a large portion of the public supports what's going on in Minneapolis? What do you think? I mean, the rest of the country, what is the tone right now?
Hi, Sean. Just want to underscore that what's happening in Minneapolis is in clear violation of the law, as Winona and Caroline have outlined for us. I think most of the country is very not in support of what's going on for ICE. I believe there's pretty recent data that suggests as much. I think for many folks, it's the first time that they're questioning whether or not this is a nation that abides by the Constitution and recognizes the rule of law. Two things of which that are not new to Native peoples, unfortunately. And given that, I mean, just recently there's also the recent detention of citizens from the Oglala Lakota Nation, which violates a whole other series of laws in addition to civil rights, but treaty rights and a violation of sovereignty of those nations to protect their own citizens. And they certainly weren't the only ones. I think there's reports of, close to 100 Native peoples that have been targeted by ICE, which to me really kind of shows very blatantly how there really isn't, ICE is not acting lawfully, because ultimately where are Native peoples going to be deported to if that's the intention here? So I think there's a lot of losing ground of the current administration.
All right. Thank you, Sandy. Caroline, back to you. In the midst of everything that's going on, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has announced that it has launched a civil rights investigation into Minneapolis for housing discrimination. This means using race and nationality to locate residents. This gives preference for people of color and people from Somalia and other foreign countries. What's your thought here? Does this signal the end, perhaps, of providing help specifically for people who might need it most?
I was reading yesterday, Lawrence Baca wrote this essay in Indian Civil Rights Act at 40. Winona's going to laugh at me because her husband also wrote that book. There's a statement in it where somebody basically if I tell you that a dog has 5 legs, that a tail is its 5th leg, right? And Abraham Lincoln asked the question and someone else answers it, and the person's like, 5 legs. And he's like, no, it doesn't actually matter. He still only has 4 legs, regardless of what you call that tail. So to me, right, that sort of sentiment really reigns true here. The Fair Housing Act is the Fair Housing Act. Congress has passed it. It's express legislation that has come from a voting body of individuals, right? And it's longstanding legislation. And whether or not the administration wants to comply with it, I mean, that's something for voters to consider, I think, in the future. Housing is so critically important to people's safety. It's one of the things that, to me, as an attorney that does human rights advocacy and as an individual who works specifically on gender-based violence within Indian country, I know, housing is so very, very, very important to individuals who are, trying to have a quality of life that is in parity with other people. And I think the idea that we're singling out even, refugees from other spaces in specific cities, or that we're
Caroline,
it's just, to me, it's
Caroline, we're going to have to take a short break, but we'll come right back. As the threat increases, tribes in the Pacific Northwest are looking for new ways to offset the damage from floods. After emergency declarations by tribes late last year, officials are hoping to build back in ways that accommodate the escalating frequency and severity of floods. We'll get a status update on the next Native America Calling.
Repatriation is the return of ancestors and stolen culture. The Association on American Indian Affairs is hosting the 11th annual Repatriation Conference, Feeding the Fire, Advancing the Movement, in February 2026. This fully virtual conference will offer small group interactive workshops, strategies, networking, and more to advance domestic and international repatriation. More at Indian-Affairs.org. The association supports this show.
Thanks for tuning in today to Native America Calling. It is a day set aside to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We're talking about where the movement that King led stands today. If you have comments or questions that you would like to share on the air, please give us a call. The number is 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. One of our guests, Caroline Laporte, is a staff attorney with the Indian Law Resource Center. She's speaking with us from Marquette, Michigan. And Caroline, we went to break there, but you were talking about the need for housing and this announcement by HUD with regard to an investigation into Minneapolis for housing discrimination. Please go ahead and finish your thoughts before I move back to Winona.
Yeah, to me, it's whether or not, and I appreciate you bringing it back, to me, it's whether or not the administration, or any administration for that matter, is bringing forth actions, whether they're investigations or they're lawsuits, in good faith. The law is what the law is. Congress has passed the Fair Housing Act. And so I think there can be all sorts of conflations, around whatever administration is in power's policy priorities or whatever diversion that they're putting in front of anybody. But the Fair Housing Act is law. And I think that to me is really the relevant point there. Interestingly, I'm in Minneapolis right now because the Department of Justice's Office of Violence Against Women is hosting a congressionally mandated tribal consultation. And so there's an interesting additional layer here where you have tribal leaders from all over the country coming to Minneapolis specifically to consult with the Department of Justice on safety for Native women. And, as you can imagine, the situation here has been one of concern.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. Thank you, Caroline. And Winona, let's bring you back into the conversation. Of course, so many people are focused right now on Minneapolis and the present, but today we want to talk about some history too. And we also want to talk about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And let's begin with the Civil Rights Act. And I'm curious to know, before the Civil Rights Act became law, citizens relied on language that was included in the Bill of Rights. What is that language, and how does it apply to Native Americans, or how did it apply to Native Americans before the Civil Rights Act?
So the Bill of Rights does, is a protection for all Native people in terms of actions of the federal government and state governments. And so, that's an important baseline issue. But then in addition to that, it's also important to note that the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution do not directly bind or tribal governments. And so that's, was affirmed in an early Supreme Court case, Talton v. Mays. And in recognition of the fact that the Bill of Rights doesn't directly impose its protections against tribal governments, Congress did pass the Indian Civil Rights Act. And so that Indian Civil Rights Act did provide for a variety of analogous rights that could be enforceable against tribal governments, but it's not an identical list of rights when you compare it to the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. So, for example, there is no prohibition against the establishment of religion, for example. And so and then in addition to that, the Indian Civil Rights Act is enforceable largely in tribal courts, and only in cases where someone's in detention in a habeas petition are they able to actually enforce the Indian Civil Rights Act in federal court. So that's an important, foundational concept to understand in terms of civil rights. But as I mentioned, all Native people also can assert their civil rights under the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights in terms of actions of federal and state governments. And we have a long history of violations of those rights. And I think that given that today's MLK Day, it's important to recognize, the challenges that tribes have faced in terms of protection of freedom of religion. There have been many cases that have refused to affirm claims of tribes that their right to protect sacred sites and their freedom of religion, they've been unable to effectively protect those rights. And there have been lots of instances, of course, in terms of freedom of assembly and speech. There have been many instances of suppression of resistance movements, and Standing Rock, for example, is a major example of that. So it's important to recognize that there have been many civil rights violations that Native people have experienced throughout history, and they continue to be challenges today, including, of course, also voting rights. And we have a long legacy in the United States of for example, polls closing or not being available in rural areas in Indian country. We have state laws that restrict the kinds of that have imposed requirements on ID that tribal members often do not have. And also we have gerrymandering in Indian country. And of course, in addition, even after tribes were granted U.S. citizenship in 1924, Nevertheless, throughout much of the 20th century, states which control voting in their states, they had many restrictions that prevented Native people from exercising the right to vote. So it's a long legacy, and there's continued struggle that we're seeing in Indian country today.
Winona, going back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, at the time it was signed, were there discussions or worries about how the law would apply to Native Americans? And if so, what were some of those conversations?
I don't think I can speak to that right now. I guess I'm going to turn it over to some of my co-panelists to see if they want to address that.
All right. Caroline or Sandy, either one of you, who would like to field this one regarding conversations or concerns during the signing of the Civil Rights Act in terms of its application towards Native American people?
This is Sandy. I'll jump in. I mean, I think throughout the struggle and even today, the notion of civil rights is a complicated issue, particularly for Native peoples who, again, are citizens of their own sovereign nations that existed prior to U.S. state formation. So, in many ways, the Native struggle was never really about incorporation into what is now the United States, like many other minoritized groups, but it was a struggle to protect the sovereignty of their own nations, which again was recognized prior to the formation of the United States. So it's a complicated struggle. Certainly that at the time they were very much in support of and advocated right alongside the leaders of the civil rights movement, the American Indian movement in particular. It's in many ways stood alongside the leaders of the civil rights movement, folks like Dennis Banks and Clyde Belcourt and Madonna Thunderhawk. Folks here, right in Connecticut, were some fierce advocates of Indigenous rights. Chief Aurelius Piper of Golden Hill Pagusset, Trudy Lamb Richmond of the Schaghticoke peoples here on many different fronts. So in many ways, the struggle for them has been around a form of dual citizenship where, if they had no protections of the Civil Rights Acts that are supposedly guaranteed to citizens, there would be increased repression of who they are. At the same time, they're very careful not, to kind of refuse the kind of incorporation into the United States that would evacuate their sovereignty as Indigenous nations.
And Sandy, talking about the present now, are civil rights for Native American people, are they viewed any differently than for other Americans?
I think there's a continued understanding of that tension between full incorporation and what it means to protect the sovereignty of one's nations and how those things have always existed in tension. At the same time, I think there's probably more folks than ever, Native peoples running for office and winning seats to serve in the U.S. government in various ways. Chief Lynn Malerba right here was at Mohegan. It just came off her service as the U.S. Treasurer. Of course, there's folks like Sharice Davis and Deb Haaland, who was the Interior Secretary. We're getting really close to actually installing Larry Pemberton here in Connecticut, who's Eastern Pequot, and is the first Native American to be elected to the Connecticut General Assembly. So I think while there's this tension, there's always also been this participation of Native peoples, who see that as a way forward.
Thank you, Sandy. The phone number for any listeners right now who would like to join in on this conversation, if you have thoughts or insights with regard to civil rights and how they apply to Native Americans, or maybe you have a thought with regard to the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. From a Native perspective, give us a call, 1-800-99-NATIVE. I want to bring a fourth guest into our conversation now. Nick Tilson joins us from Rapid City, South Dakota. He is the president and CEO of Indian Collective, and he is Oglala Lakota. Nick, good morning, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you, Nick, what is your gauge for civil rights progress right now? You know, looking back over the history, thinking of Martin Luther King back in the 1960s, and now here we are today, what we're seeing in Minneapolis and elsewhere in the United States. How far have we come, really? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think we got to pay homage and respect to Dr. Martin Luther King and those from his generation who fought fiercely, and I think that many of those rights, are the foundation in which we stand on today, along with all of the other indigenous leaders who fought for indigenous rights. But those very rights, both civil rights, treaty rights, human rights, are all being tested at this moment in huge ways. And I do think that the rise of authoritarianism in this country is the biggest threat to tribal sovereignty. It is the biggest threat to human rights, and it is the biggest threat to civil rights. And I think that when you have leadership in this country who does not care about the courts, who does not care about whether federal courts are going to make this decision or that decision, and they're going to move ahead and pursue violence amongst the people and use tax-paying dollars to move their agenda, is dangerous. So I think that all of the treaty rights, civil rights, and human rights are at stake in this moment, and I think as much as they've ever been in the history of this country. And it does not negate all of the hard work of lawyers and civil rights leaders and treaty people from the past. It's just acknowledgement of that things are at a different state right now than they have ever been. And it's interesting because now, most people are now being treated across this country how Indian people have always been treated in this country, with not having equal protections under the law and not having those equal protections under the law be interpreted the same way by the courts, therefore how our people are treated. So I think that's why, in part, why you're seeing such an uprising is that America's pissed. America is upset. And it's interesting because as Indian people, we sit back and say, hey, we're actually pretty used to not having equal protections under the law and not being treated fairly or the same and having to fight tooth and nail just to exist, just to live, and just to be. And I think the temperature of the country, we're at a crossroads without a doubt.
Nick, that's a really good point, that now other people are seeing what we have, as Native people, have been experiencing for decades, for centuries, actually. Does it ever bother you now that this is what it's taken for other people to finally see what it's like to be galvanized? Does that bother you at all, or do you just see this as kind of just, what is the saying, the arc of human history is long, but it bends towards justice? What's your thought?
It doesn't bother me. I mean, in the sense that, I think that right now is the moment, and I think the moment is ripe to mobilize in this country. And I think the reality is Indigenous people have to unite with our immigrant relatives. We have to unite with our Black relatives. We have to unite across class, across gender, across race, across tribes, because I think that the enemy is coming for everybody's rights collectively. And so, do I wish this would have happened a long time ago so we wouldn't have to be in the dire situation that we are in to mobilize with one another? Absolutely. But does it upset me? No. I'm glad that people are waking up across this country. And, I've been in Minneapolis for the past 10 days. I just got back last night. And what you're actually seeing on the streets of Minneapolis is inspirational as far as neighborhoods and communities, organizations collaboratively working together to keep communities safe when the law enforcement agencies have not done their job, when the systems that have been in place haven't done their job. They've mostly criminalized our people, have not made our communities safer. And so what you're seeing now is the implementation of community-based systems of community care and communities and neighborhoods acting in their sovereignty. And I think that's inspirational. I do think that tribes and Indigenous people have a unique role to play in this political moment that we're in. I think that tribes have to exercise their tribal sovereignty and to call for bans on ICE, not just within the boundaries of the reservations, but within the boundaries of our entire treaty territories. And I think that can create protections not only for Indigenous people and tribal members, but it can challenge the current political dichotomy of what's happening. And, I think that when tribal sovereignty is exercised, history will tell us that's when tribal sovereignty is strengthened.
Nick Tilson, President and CEO of Hindon Collective. He joins us now from Rapid City, South Dakota, but he just mentioned he has spent the previous 10 days in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on the ground, organizing, being in meetings involved. Really appreciate his insights on the show, joining the conversation. And, of course, the phone lines are open so you can join the conversation, too. And I would really like to hear from some listeners. What are your thoughts right now with regard to what you're seeing in Minneapolis and elsewhere in the United States? Again, on this day today, Martin Luther King Jr., his day of honor, his legacy, in terms of the progress of civil rights in this country. I'd really like to hear from some listeners in terms of what you've seen just in your own lifetime, since you were a child or maybe since you were a teenager, how things have changed, how things have evolved. Are they improving? Are they getting worse? What do you think? You can join us. You can share your thoughts. 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. And you can also use our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, any of those platforms, or our website, Native America Calling, as well. More with Nick Tilson and our other guests on the other side of this break, so stay with us.
Support by Sonosky Chambers Law, championing tribal sovereignty and Native American rights since 1976. From opioids litigation to treaty rights to tribal self-governance. With offices in Washington, D.C., New Mexico, California, and Alaska. Sonosky Chambers Law.
Kaufman & Associates is a Native-owned and led consulting firm, supporting Native communities with culturally grounded solutions to shape Indigenous futures. More at Kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
We are glad you're listening today to Native America Calling. This is your platform for Native people to share your thoughts, perspectives, and insights. And today we're talking about civil rights. Which Native civil rights leaders do you look up to? Let us know. Give us a call, 1-800-996-2848. We have a caller on the line. This is Alex in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who is listening on radio station KUNM. Hello, Alex. You're on the air.
Hey, Sean. Thanks a lot for another great show. My daughter sees Navajo and Colombian American. So we always talk about the disunity, the disorganization of the different movements that should be working together. We both worked for Bernie Sanders, and just the fact that, what the last panelist was talking about, the need for us to recognize that we're all in this together. And, Native people have had to suffer for too long, and it's time that we all work together towards something positive and something where we kind of rally behind folks who are really going to represent our needs as people in this community.
So, yeah, Alex, I really appreciate that comment. I want to ask you, how do you feel right now, just overall? I mean, I talk to so many people, and they're feeling disillusioned, they're feeling discouraged, it's just taking a toll on a lot of folks. And how are you just getting by and enduring it? And again, all these words of unification and team building. How does that really happen? How does it all work?
Sean, I'm a teacher in the South Valley, and I have a lot of Brown and Native students, and I try to keep them hopeful. And we that's kind of the message of Dr. King. No matter what the circumstances are, no matter how hard they hit you, you got to keep getting up and keep fighting for your rights. And I think that still resonates today among young people. My daughter's a college freshman, and she's going to learn pre-law. So she's still really hopeful. Everyone's really hopeful. I mean, we want to end the brutality as quickly as possible. So in this negative time, I try to emphasize the positive, that kind of lights are being turned on everybody, and hopefully we can all unite and get past it together.
Right on. Alex, thanks so much for calling into the show today. Let's go back to the phones where we have Jen, who is listening to our show online. She's in East Texas. Hi, Jen. You were on the air today.
Yes, I really appreciate all the guests today, especially Mr. Tilson, who's in Minnesota today. I really think this is the perfect program for us to celebrate Martin Luther King's life and all the strides he made, and especially to remember the young people who died in all of that. And this, I know that there are many people in Minnesota standing up along and Native Americans working together, but we really are faced, as Martin Luther King said, with the fierce urgency of now. Never has a president ever in my history, and I've lived through Watts and I've lived through the Martin Luther King's March and all that, but never has a president set out this much military. And that is a very scary action, and we should be very afraid. If they're treating white people that way, you know how they're treating Native Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for calling in. Appreciate you joining the conversation. And Nick Tilson, I want to go back to you, founder and CEO of Indian Collective. And earlier you mentioned the courts, and you talked about, as Native people thinking about working with other people, other populations of color, building and forging partnerships. And let's talk about the Supreme Court now, largely supportive of what we're seeing from the Trump administration. It says Native Americans and others should not be afforded special considerations when it comes to issues like voting, education access, workplace hiring. And again, I really question, where does this all lead? And, the need to build these coalitions. And what happens if we're not able to do that, or we can't do it on time? What's in store for us? 'Cause I think so many people are just worried, like, what's going to happen? What's my life going to look like in a year or 2 years and 3 years from now if things continue the way they're going?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think the urgency, I think there's a difference of organizing and reacting from a place of fear, as opposed to a place of urgency and tactic. And I do think that we have to really take a deep look at our tactics that we use. I think that sometimes when we fight for tribal sovereignty in a bubble, and we actually don't think about the cases and the things that we're being forced about the other people in this country and other people of color in this country, and vice versa, it creates invisibilization, right? It creates invisibilization. And so I think that we have to think about strategies that are equitable. What decisions and what legal strategies and what political strategies can we take forth in this moment that advances the rights of all people and Mother Earth too? And what does that look like? And I think that with the rise of authoritarianism, with this idea of just a handful of people having total political control and control of the courts and control of the military and control of the political systems, you have a very dangerous situation. And I think that it's important for us to collaborate together. I think it's important for us to think outside of the box. I think that we have to reflect on many of the rights that we have achieved over time, and how sometimes those rights have been used to pit against people, pit against groups of people. And I think the other thing that in this moment, and especially on this day being, MLK Day, is that we have to remember that courts in the end are the interpretation of laws. And those laws get interpreted differently by courts when people rise up. My grandfather, Ken Tilson, who won and lost more draft resistance cases than any lawyer in the history of America, he wrote a book called Judging the Judges. And his book was compelling because it talked about how people were getting, 5-7 years in jail and prison for resisting the draft at the beginning of the Vietnam War. But by the end of the Vietnam War, people are getting 5 or 10 hours of community service. Yet in that period of time, no laws actually changed. Mm-hmm. It was the social movement of the time that informed the judges and how they reacted differently. And I think that we're in a time where we actually have to have huge amounts of social upheaval and resistance in order to keep testing those systems.
Nick, thank you. That's a really good point. I'd like for Caroline to weigh in here now because you remind me of one of the first lessons I learned in high school civics or junior high civics, that the Supreme Court specifically, their role is to interpret the law. And Caroline, as an attorney and also as someone who is an associate judge, what do we need to understand about how laws are being interpreted in terms of what we're seeing now? Some of the concerns, the rhetoric, we all hear it. I'd like you to weigh in here and just provide some advice, because again, I think a lot of people are really questioning now, where does the Supreme Court fit, or other courts for that matter, with regard to an interpretation of the law, and how are they going about that process?
Yeah, I mean, look, Winona and Sandy also probably have great responses for this, and I appreciate, Mr. Tillerson, your points, and certainly your memory of your father. That was lovely that you shared that, or your grandfather. There's, to me, a lack of civic learning and just civics 101 in this country in general. I think most people would agree with that. I find, like, for example, I am also an associate professor, and Winona teaches, and so does Sandy, and I think I'm not going to speak for both of them, but what I find is that younger individuals or individuals who are currently in school and looking to graduate, they are very, very, very concerned about what their prospects are, what things look like, et cetera. And I think a big part of that is that there's some misunderstanding, right, of the ways in which those systems work and the power that individuals in this country have, like Mr. Tillerson pointed out, like when we come together, right, and that there is a power in the collective that is very real, and it's not just, some sort of existential, like, gathering of individuals, but that really what it means to be a part of the United States of America, what it should mean, is that we are all part of a government that we elect. And I think the other thing people are realizing is that, yeah, of course the court interprets the law that Congress passes, right? That's their job. That's Congress's job. And Congress isn't passing a lot of legislation. That becomes a problem. So that's sort of another big gap at the moment. The other thing is realizing that your vote matters, right? Because presidents and executive branches install a lot of the judiciary in this country. That matters. That means that your vote matters within that space too. So I think, to me, that's where I would like to leave it. I mean, ethically, there's not only so many things I can comment on as a judge, obviously, but just understanding the importance of an individual's vote and of a community's vote, right? And the ways in which we, like Nick said, the ways in which we engage in our collective communities and then those communities connect with other communities is super, super important, not just for educating individuals who are policymakers or change makers, but really for also educating each other.
Thank you, Caroline. Winona, I'd like you to weigh in now as well with regard to the role of the courts here in 2026. And also, again, any historical insights that we can tie back to Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, or the Civil Rights Act, in fact.
Yeah, so as I've been listening to the conversation and listening also to folks talk about the very important issue of, how do we galvanize and how do we organize and strategize, I just want to comment that I think it's also important as part of that strategy that we identify what are the potential harms that we might see coming over the horizon, so that we can think about how we strategize those to address those specific potential harms, given what we currently know about the Trump administration. And I think this does feed into, the role of the courts. And so one of those, severe potential harms is the expansion of unchecked federal plenary power over tribes. With a rise of authoritarianism, there's more consolidation of power in the executive and less checks exercised by the judiciary and the legislature, Congress. And so tribes are extremely vulnerable because plenary power includes the power to terminate as well. And in addition, with the rise of authoritarianism, we see a greater erosion of judicial independence and the rule of law. And currently, we have 261 Trump appointees in the federal judiciary, which makes up about just over 25% of all federal judges. the New York Times just did a study and found that they decide overwhelmingly in favor of the Trump administration when there are challenges to Trump policies that are litigated. And I think the percentage was something like 92% of the time. And then also what we're seeing, what we can anticipate with the rise of authoritarianism is more criminalization of indigenous resistance and protest. And as we're already seeing, protesters are being described as domestic terrorists. And we already know that this has happened, and that's concerning because that's coupled with greater militarization of law enforcement in Indian country as well. And we're seeing, of course, ICE's actions using tear gas and using, weapons that cause deadly harm, that's a huge risk, and that there's a long legacy of that already occurring in Indian country historically. But that could be, there's a lot of risk that if tribes if they show resistance to the administration, that they may experience that as a form of retaliation. And this leads to, also the administration acting to undermine tribal jurisdiction and self-determination, and also related to the issue of, the housing issue is we'll see the Trump administration continue to weaponize civil rights in favor of what they describe as colorblind equity and use that against tribes, characterizing tribal issues as issues that violate equal protection. And I think we're going to see more of that. So not to mention, of course, more federal censorship in our educational institutions and in information. And so we have to be able to organize against all of that. It's a huge, and so I think it's really important that we be specific about what's potentially coming up over the horizon when we talk about how we're going to use the courts to resist and how we can organize together.
All right. Thank you, Winona. And I want to go back to Dr. Sandy Grande for the last closing comment on the show today as we wind down. And Sandy, we heard earlier the talk about, having an informed citizenry and people just understanding how government works. And I think a lot of people, question now, do we really, how much attention are people really paying? How much learning is really going into the process? And you, as a professor of political science and Native American and Indigenous studies, I think you're uniquely qualified just to talk about, the role of just getting people informed and understanding how government works and understanding the political process. Because I'm always kind of conflicted with Martin Luther King Day because it's a holiday. People take the day off and they kind of hang out. But I think Dr. King probably, if it was up to him, he would probably want people in school right now learning about this history, not taking the day off. I think that would probably be what his spirit would say. So what's your thought? We got about a minute before we got to wrap it up.
Sure. I agree with Caroline, who earlier said, young people, I think, thankfully, come to classes, maybe overwhelmed a bit, but absolutely hungry. And when they get the knowledge about, what is happening, what is going on, how can they participate in governance, I think, you can start to see them become empowered. And maybe the last thing, because a lot of talk from everybody, which I agree with, was about working together and forming coalitions. And, is this the end of it, and the importance of not giving up the struggle? I would think about in the night before Dr. King was assassinated, in his sort of famous Beyond the Mountaintop speech, thought about, if God let him choose to be alive at any time, he responded that he would still choose to be alive in, his present day. And that people might have found that surprising because, in his words, the nation was sick, there's trouble in the land. But the quote that always sticks with me is that he said, because somehow only when it's dark enough can you see the stars. And I understand that to mean like it's in these times when we can see the sites of struggle, the sites of possibility, sites to build coalition. And I think among those stars are really the indigenous nations among us that make this a plurinational place.
All right. Thank you so much, Sandy, for closing us out here. Big thanks to all of our guests, Dr. Sandy Grande, Nick Tilson, Winona Single, and Caroline Laporte. Join us again tomorrow. We'll be back. Same place, same time. I'm Sean Spruce. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Support by the American Indian College Fund. The American Indian College Fund provides millions of dollars of scholarships to thousands of Native students every year. Tribal citizens of every age and experience are eligible. The deadline for applications is May 31st, and you can find everything you need to apply at collegefund.org. That's collegefund.org or by phone at 800-766-FUND. Education is the answer.
Every family caregiver could use help finding the necessary resources to care for their loved one. The AARP Family Caregiver Resource Guide helps family caregivers access key programs, services, and agencies in their communities. A copy of the guide is available by calling 877-333-5885 or online at aarp.org/caregiverresources. AARP supports this show.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.